Curious George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, he's always on the go. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Where's he going? We'd all like to know.
Curious George at the drive-in movie. It was a warm summer evening. George and the man with the yellow hat decided to go to a drive-in movie. They parked their little blue car right in front of the big movie screen. "Let's go to the food stand before the movie starts," said the man to George. "You get some popcorn, and I'll get some lemonades, and we'll meet back here at the car." The food stand was behind the last row of cars. George got in line for a box of popcorn. He could smell the fresh buttered popcorn ahead of him. He couldn't wait. The line was moving very slowly. George noticed a little puppy. Maybe it was lost. It licked George's face. It was so happy to have found a friend. Finally, George bought his popcorn and shared some with his new friend. Suddenly, a bright light came from the big screen. The movie had started. George looked up and saw a beam of light coming out of an open window. What was it like inside the projection room? George was curious. How could he get up there? Under the open window was a delivery truck. George, holding the puppy under one arm, climbed to the roof of the truck. Now George tried to look into the open window, but the light was too bright to see anything. He turned away from the light. Suddenly, the people in the car started to laugh. The shadow of George and the puppy was on the screen. They were blocking the movie. As George and the puppy moved back and forth in the light, the shadows moved on and off the screen. More people were laughing. This was funnier than the movie. The projectionist in the booth heard all the laughing and honking. What was going on? He stuck his head out the window and saw George and the puppy standing in the light of the projector. "Hey, you, get down from there," he shouted. With the puppy under one arm, George quickly got down from the top of the truck. The projectionist came running out to chase him and was just about to catch him. "Wait, there's my puppy." And a woman came running up to George. The man with the yellow hat was right behind her. The woman took the puppy from George and gave it a big hug. Then she turned to George. "You've saved the day," she said. "I thought I lost my puppy for good until I saw his shadow on the screen." "I was glad to see your shadow, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "I thought I'd lost you too." "Well," said the projectionist, "I guess I'm glad people had a chance to see you on the screen after all. Now you'd better get back to your car or you'll miss the rest of the movie." George and the man with the yellow hat ate what was left of the popcorn, drank their lemonade, and watched the movie.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He must know what everything's about. Curious George, the curious little monkey. What's he up to? Let's find out.
Curious George at the parade. "Today is the day of the big parade, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "There will be marching bands and clowns and floats from many countries. Let's go early to watch the people finish their floats." Soon they were at the parade grounds. There was a float from Mexico with a huge sombrero all made of yellow flowers. And there was a float from Holland with a windmill driving a small water wheel. And there were many more floats. "They're going to give a prize to the best float at the parade, George," said the man. "Take a closer look, but don't get into trouble." The next float came from Germany. It had the biggest clock that George had ever seen. What was inside it? George was curious. He jumped onto the float and disappeared behind the clock. Suddenly, the clock struck 3. A door opened. Figure after figure came out. And right in the middle of it was George. Some men were still working on the float. "Look," one of them said, "there's a real monkey." "He might break the clock," shouted the other one. "Quick, let's go up and get him." It was time to get away. George jumped off the clock and ran over to the next float with animals and a palm tree on it. A man was sitting under the tree playing a drum. This must be the African float. The parade started. It was too late for George to leave now. The parade went down the street. Float after float went past the judges' stand. The judges would decide which float would get first prize. As the African float passed by the stand, George looked out of the tree and saw his friend, the man with the yellow hat, standing near the judges. George waved to him, and the man waved back.
"Look, did you see that live monkey on the float?"
one of the judges cried.
"What a marvelous idea. Very realistic,"
said another judge. Everyone cheered and applauded George up in the tree. And George waved at them. At the end of the parade, the judge awarded the first prize to the African float. The man who had been playing the drum accepted the trophy.
"Congratulations,"
said the judge.
"Thank you,"
said the man. Then he turned to George.
"This is your prize,"
he said.
"Hold everything,"
said a man rushing through the crowd.
"That little monkey almost ruined our clock float. He caused a lot of trouble." "Well, what should we do about this?"
asked the judge. George was sad.
"But, Judge," said the man from the African float, "we wouldn't have one without him."
"I guess we'll let him go," said the man from the clock float. "There wasn't much damage."
"And George can keep his prize,"
added the judge. "I have an idea," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's all go back to our house and celebrate." And so they did. What a nice way to end the day.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Oh, what fun to run and jump and play. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Let's go see what he's doing today.
Curious George at the photographer's studio. "Look at that snow, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Brr, it sure is cold outside today, but I have to go out just the same. I'll see you later. Remember, don't get into trouble." George was alone. What should he do now? Why not go over to see his neighbor Alice, who was a photographer? Alice was setting up her camera and lights when George came in. "Hello, George. Nice to see you," she said. "Maybe you can be my helper today. I'm going to take some pictures of the Wilson family this morning." "This is film for the camera," she said. "Stand behind me when I'm taking the pictures. When I run out of film, you hand me a new box. But be careful. There are long wires on the floor. Don't trip over them or all the lights will go out." The doorbell rang, and in came Mr. and Mrs. Wilson with Peggy and Roger. "Hello there," said Alice. "I'm just about ready for you. Please put your coats in the closet. The light should be on in there." They hung up their coats and took off their boots. Will you all come over here, please, said Alice, and let me group you for the picture? Why don't you sit in this chair, she said to Mrs. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, you stand beside your wife. Peggy, you sit on your mother's lap. Roger, stand in front of your father. Then she looked at the family through the camera. Everyone was smiling, except Roger. I don't want my picture taken, he said. I want to go outside and play in the snow. How could she make Roger smile? Roger, say cheese, said Alice. I don't like cheese, Roger said. Come on, Roger, please smile for the camera, said his mother. We're going to send this picture to Grandma, said Roger's father. But nothing made Roger smile. Wait, said Alice. I have just the thing. George watched her take something out of a box on the floor next to the camera. It was a toy bird. Okay, she said, now watch the birdie. But Roger still didn't smile. George wanted to see the birdie, too. Maybe he could see better from the other side of the camera. But George didn't watch where he was going. He tripped over the wire and all the lights in the studio went out. Oh, no, cried Alice. Now we'll never get this picture taken. George, I warned you about those wires. Then she went over to the Wilsons. Please stay where you are, she said. Everything will be fixed in a moment. George finally freed himself from the wires. He saw some light coming from inside the closet. George was curious. Very carefully, he went over to see what was inside. After a while, the lights came back on. All right, everyone, Alice said. Let's begin again. Suddenly, the closet door opened, and out came George. Look at him, shouted Roger. He's got on Mother's fur hat and Peggy's coat and Dad's boots. George looked so funny that everybody laughed. Hooray for George, Alice said. Quick, let's take the pictures right now. Even Roger was smiling. Thank you, George, he said, and shook his hand. You're a good photographer's helper after all. You better go home now. Maybe your friend has come back.
Curious George, a curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, a curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Let's go and see.
Curious George plays baseball. Your friend Jimmy is waiting outside to play ball with you, George, said the man with the yellow hat. You two have fun, but don't get into trouble. George went out to the front yard. There was Jimmy, the boy who lived next door, holding a bat and a baseball. Come on, George, let's start the game, he shouted. He gave George his bat and pitched the first ball. Uh-oh, George swung and missed. Try again, George, said Jimmy, and pitched the ball back. George really hit it this time. The ball whizzed through the air and disappeared. Jimmy and George looked everywhere, but they couldn't find it. Maybe we can use something else as a ball, said Jimmy. George looked at the apple tree in his front yard. What would it be like to hit an apple? George was curious. He climbed the tree and picked the biggest apple he could find. Then he gave it to Jimmy. Okay, said Jimmy, I'll pitch again and you bat. Jimmy pitched the apple. George swung the bat. The apple sailed over Jimmy's head, crossed the street, and splattered all over Jimmy's house. Oh, no, cried Jimmy. It hit the window of my baby sister's room. She's taking a nap. I hope they didn't wake her up. Let's go see. They ran over to the house to take a closer look. What a mess. There were pieces of apple all over the window. Jimmy's father came out of the house. Look what you've done to the window, he said. I told you not to play near the house today. You know your mother isn't home and I have to take care of things. Go to your room, Jimmy. And George, you clean up the mess. You've got 4 hands to work with. George got a bucket and a sponge and came back to clean the window. How good that he was a monkey. He climbed right up to the 2nd floor of Jimmy's house and scrubbed the window. Now the glass was clean and he could look inside. But what was the matter? Something seemed wrong. The baby was awake and the front side of the crib had been left down. Next to the crib on a little table stood a bottle of milk. The baby was moving toward the edge of the bed, trying to grab the bottle. She might fall and hurt herself. George tried and tried to open the window to get inside and stop her. The window was locked, but George knew what to do. He leaped over to the next window, which was Jimmy's room. George tapped on the window. "What are you doing here?" asked Jimmy as he rushed over and opened his window. Quickly, George took Jimmy's hand and led him across the hall to the baby's room. When they opened the door, the baby was about to fall out of the crib. They got there just in time. Jimmy's father came running into the room. "What's all the noise in here?" he shouted. "George saved the baby," said Jimmy. "Somebody must have left the front of the crib open." Just then, the doorbell rang. Jimmy and George went to see who it was. It was the man with the yellow hat holding a baseball. "Jimmy," he said, "I just found your baseball not too far from the old apple tree. Why don't we all go to the park and play baseball together?" Jimmy's father and the baby joined them. "Can we, Dad?" asked Jimmy. "Yes," he said. "As soon as your mother comes home, I'll come over and be the catcher." It turned out to be a great day after all.
To George, the curious little monkey. He must know what everything's about. Curious George, the curious little monkey. What's he up to? Let's find out.
Curious George goes to a department store. "George, there's a big sale on at the department store today," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's see if we can find a bargain." "I'm going down to the basement," said the man. "You look around, George, and I'll meet you right here under the big clock in an hour. Have a good time, but remember, don't get into trouble." George looked at all the things in the store. There were so many things to see. A salesgirl was holding a small bottle with a rubber ball attached to it. "Try this perfume, madam," she said to a lady in a big fur coat. "It has a nice smell." The lady squeezed the ball and sniffed the perfume. George also had a sniff. Smelled like flowers. There were 4 more bottles just like the first one. George was curious. He jumped on the counter. He started squeezing and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. He got dizzy from all that sniffing.
"What's that monkey doing up there?" shouted the lady in the fur coat.
George was scared. He dropped the perfume bottle. It broke and spilled all over the lady's coat. Quickly, George jumped down and disappeared.
There was a potted plant. George climbed up and looked around. A lot of boxes were on top of some shelves. What was inside? George was curious.
He swung from the tree, knocking over all the boxes. "What's going on?" screamed a lady. "It's like an earthquake." Another lady in a red dress was covered with boots. One of the boxes fell onto the head of a salesman.
"He did it," shouted the lady, pointing at George. George jumped down and ran to the escalators. The shoe salesman ran after him, followed by the lady in the red dress.
Then George leaped on the up escalator. He was halfway up when the salesman and the lady got on at the bottom. Catch him, they cried. How good that George was a monkey. He jumped from the up escalator onto the down one. Now they couldn't catch him. He waved goodbye to the salesman and the lady as he passed them. He was safe. The escalator took him all the way down to the basement. Maybe he could find his friend down here. He looked around. There was a salesgirl showing how a carpet sweeper worked. She threw some small pieces of paper on the carpet, then went over them with the sweeper. The pieces were gone. How did she do it? George was curious. "I'll take one of those sweepers," said the woman with the big fur coat, "and I want to charge it, please." She still smelled like a bottle of perfume. As she opened her purse, a bunch of keys fell out and landed on the carpet, just as the sweeper started forward again. "Oh, my keys," shouted the woman. "My bank keys and the key to my jewelry box." But George knew what to do. He swung between the ropes, leaned way over, and grabbed the keys before the sweeper could swallow them. Just then, the shoe salesman and the lady in the red dress had finally caught up with George. "There he is. Don't let him get away," the salesman shouted. "Please, please don't scold him. He saved my keys," said the lady in the big fur coat. She shook George's hand. "Are you all alone?" "No, he's with me," said a voice from behind. It was the man with the yellow hat coming through the crowd. "I'm his friend," he added. "Come on, George. Let's get the bus and go home." "Bus?" said the woman. "Oh, no, not after what George did for me. Please let me take you both home in my car." And so she did. What a nice way to get home.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's so full of curiosity. Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's as curious can be.
Curious George at the fire station. Today, George and his friend, the man with the yellow hat, were visiting the fire station. The fire chief met them in front of the station. "Hello, George," he said. "Your friend tells me you want to be a fireman when you grow up. How would you like to wear this fireman's hat today?" George loved to wear the hat, even though it was a little big for him. They went inside and looked at the fire engines. "We're proud of our engines," said the chief. "We keep them as bright and shiny as we can." Up on a ladder, one fireman was polishing a big brass bell on the wall. "That is our alarm bell," said the chief. "It starts to ring whenever there is a fire to put out." There was another brass bell on the fire engine. "We ring that bell on our way to the fire, George," said the chief, "so that people will hear us coming and get out of the way." "And this is Sally, our Dalmatian. She goes to all the fires with us. She just had a litter of 10 puppies. They're still too young to be playing down here. They have their basket on the second floor where the firemen stay. Would you like to go up and see the puppies?" Of course he would. George and the man with the yellow hat went up to the second floor. There in a straw basket were 10 little Dalmatian puppy dogs. They were so small they could barely stand up. "Yip, yip, yip," they barked in their tiny voices. One of them tried to jump up and lick George's face. Not far from the basket was a big round hole with a pole in the middle that went straight down to the floor below. "When the alarm rings," said the chief, "all the firemen slide down that pole to the fire engines. You may slide down if you want, George, but be careful." Whee! George held onto his hat and slid down the pole like a real fireman. Then he ran over to the fire engine with the brass bell on it and climbed behind the steering wheel. What would it be like to put out a real fire? George was curious. "Make way! Here comes George the fireman." George rang the brass bell on the engine. Clang, clang, clang. The firemen heard the bell. What was going on? They hadn't heard any alarm, but maybe there was a fire. "Who's ringing the engine bell?" cried a fireman. "Fire! Fire!" another one shouted. They all jumped into their uniforms and slid down the pole. When they got to the fire engine, all they saw was a little monkey ringing the bell. "George," said the fire chief, "you've gone too far. Fighting fires is a serious business. Get off the engine right now." George felt terrible. Suddenly, Sally the Dalmatian started to bark. She was looking up to the top of the fire pole. Then the fireman looked up, too. One of the puppies had gotten out of its basket and was looking over the edge of the hole. One more step and it would fall down. What could they do to stop it? But George knew what to do. Nobody could climb up the pole as fast as he could. With one hand, he held out his hat to catch the puppy in case it should fall. And sure enough, the puppy slipped and plop, landed right in George's hat. "Hooray for George!" shouted the fireman as George brought the puppy down. Then Sally licked it all over to make sure it was all right. "That was using your head, George," said the chief. "In fact, for saving the puppy, you're now an honorary fireman of our station. You can keep the hat, and you can visit us anytime." "As long as you don't get into any trouble," added the man with the yellow hat. Then George and the man waved goodbye to everyone, and off they went in their little blue car.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Well, let's go and see.
Curious George at the farm. "Finish your milk, George, and then we can drive out to Jackson's farm," said the man with the yellow hat. After lunch, they got into the car and drove off. In a little while, they were on a winding country road. After a few miles, they saw a sign, Jackson's Farm. There were lots of cows in the field. A young farm boy was taking them to the big red barn. The car stopped in front of a white farmhouse. Mr. Jackson was there to greet him. His daughter Sally was carrying a tiny white kitten. "Welcome," said Mr. Jackson. "Come on in and have a cup of coffee." "While we're inside, George," said the man with the yellow hat, "take a look around, but don't get into trouble." George headed for the big red barn. He pushed the barn door open. The cows had gone inside and were already in their stalls. It was feeding time. What were they going to eat? George was curious. He jumped to the top of the stall and looked down. The feed box was filled with corn and oats. The cow took a big mouthful. Then it turned to look at George. George was scared. He jumped down and knocked over a pail full of milk. There he was in the middle of a big puddle. "What's going on?" a voice shouted. "So it was you," said the farm boy. "You little rascal. I have to tell Mr. Jackson about this." George was scared. He hid behind the door. Suddenly, George saw the little white kitten run through the open barn door. "Here, kitty, kitty," Sally was calling. The kitty was licking the spilled milk. Then it jumped to the top of the feed box and looked down into it. Just as the kitten stretched out its paw, the cow raised its head. Whoosh! The kitten was thrown into the air and landed way up on a narrow wooden beam. It did not know how to get down again. George was watching. He knew what to do. He climbed up the rope, reached out as far as he could, and saved the kitten. Just then, the farm boy, Sally, Mr. Jackson, and the man with the yellow hat came running in. "That's the fellow who spilled the milk," the boys shouted. "But he saved my kitten," said Sally. George climbed down and handed the kitten over to Sally. "Never mind about the spilled milk now," said Mr. Jackson. "Thanks to you, George, Sally has got her kitten back." "And now, George," said the man with the yellow hat, "it's time to go home." And off they went in their little blue car.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Oh, what fun to run and jump and play. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Let's go see what he's doing today.
Curious George at the beach. It's a very warm day today, George, said the man with the yellow hat. Why don't we take the day off and go to the beach? We haven't gone swimming in a long time. They got into their little blue car and drove off. It was very crowded. There was a parking space very close to the beach. George was anxious to run off. I'm going to change into my trunk, said the man. Don't get into trouble. I'll see you on the beach in a while. George looked around. There were people having fun in the water. A lady in a blue dress was with her grandson and was carrying a beach chair. Look, Grandma, there's a monkey, said the little boy, pointing at George. George waved at the boy and walked on. Nearby, a group of boys and girls were playing volleyball. George wanted to play with them, but they kept pushing him aside. George looked up at the net. He leaped up onto it, and then, when the ball came his way, he grabbed it. What fun! Then he jumped way over the heads of the players and landed on the sand. Hey, that's not the way to play volleyball, someone shouted. Give us back the ball, another player cried. They started to chase him. George dropped the ball and ran as fast as he could. Now where could he go? Further down the beach, he saw a lifeguard tower. While the lifeguard was pulling his rowboat out of the water, George climbed up the ladder to the tower. On the platform near him was a pair of binoculars and a whistle hanging from a string. The lifeguard would blow the whistle if anyone got in trouble. George picked up the binoculars and looked through them. Everything seemed so close. There was a wooden pier. Nobody seemed to be on it, except the boy he had seen with his grandma. She was asleep in her beach chair. George kept looking through his binoculars. The boy was running so fast, he didn't even notice that two boards were missing. There was a wide open space where he could fall through. George put down the binoculars and blew the lifeguard's whistle. He leaped down from the tower and leaped up to the pier. Just as he was about to fall through it, George grabbed him. The lifeguard had heard the whistle and ran over to the pier. Then the grandma rushed over, followed by the man with the yellow hat. If it wasn't for you, George, this little boy would have been in real trouble, said the lifeguard. You sure are a brave little guy. We're going to make you an honorary lifeguard here at the beach. Then the grandma picked up George and gave him a big hug. Thank you so much. You saved my grandson's life, she said. Then she turned to the man with the yellow hat. Won't you have something to eat with us? So they all went to have lunch on the beach. There were lots of sandwiches, a homemade apple pie, some ice cream, and chocolate cake. A hero deserves a good meal, said the lady, and George agreed. After lunch, George and his friend got in their little blue car and drove back home.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He must know what everything's about. Curious George, the curious little monkey. What's he up to? Let's find out.
Curious George visits a police station.
Today we are invited to the opening of the new police station, said the man with the yellow hat. Let's get going, George. The police station was in a new brick building in the middle of town. The police chief, the mayor, and other guests were standing on the steps when George and his friend arrived.
Let's go inside and look things over,
said the mayor. The first thing the chief showed them was the new alarm system.
If a prisoner tries to escape, guards will know right away.
How did that system work? George was curious, but he couldn't get close to it. So he wandered off by himself. In the basement, there were several jail cells. George climbed up the bars and swung from cell to cell. The door first swung out wide and then clanged shut. George swung over to the next door. While he was busy swinging, the mayor had come down with the chief to inspect the cells. George did not notice that they had walked into one of them. Suddenly, he heard shouting. Oh, no. He had locked up the mayor and the chief in one of the cells.
Help! Somebody open that door right away, the mayor shouted. Who did that?
It was that little monkey, the chief cried.
Guards, get him.
Meanwhile, the crowd was waiting for the mayor to start the opening ceremony. Why didn't he come? No one was near the alarm system now. In the middle of it was a red button. What would happen if he pushed it? George was curious. He pushed the button. Suddenly, sirens started to scream. Lots of policemen came running from all directions. Now George was really in trouble. A policeman saw him.
Catch that monkey, he shouted.
George ran down the stairs to the basement with the policeman right after him.
Lock him up, someone cried.
Then they discovered the mayor and the chief locked in the cell. Good heavens, how did you ever get in there? A guard asked.
Never mind, the chief said angrily. Just get us out of here.
The policeman was still holding George when the men finally were freed.
Shall I lock him up, he asked. Well, he did lock us up, but then he did finally bring you fellows down here to get us out, so I guess we'll let him go. Now, let's get upstairs and start the ceremony.
George was alone in the basement. Soon, he was swinging up and down the bars once more. In the middle of the ceremony, a policeman came and whispered to the chief. We have a problem, he said. One of the jail cells got locked again.
Not again. Is that monkey still at it? Asked the chief.
They rushed down to see who got caught this time. Were they surprised when they found out? It was that monkey again.
I ought to leave you there to teach you a lesson, said the chief.
But then the chief smiled.
Let him go, he said.
Thanks, Chief, said the man with the yellow hat. They opened the door, and George jumped right into his friend's arms. Let's go home, said the man. Enough is enough.
Curious George, curious little monkey. Here he comes, he's always on the go. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Where's he going? We'd all like to know.
Curious George at the laundromat. Our washing machine is broken, George, said the man with the yellow hat. We'll have to take the clothes to the laundromat. At the laundromat, they met Mrs. Goodman, who lived next door. I have to wash my children's baseball uniforms, she said. They have a baseball game today, but they can't play if their uniforms are dirty. George watched her take the uniforms out of her clothes basket and put them into the washing machine. She poured some soap in. Then she pushed a handle, and the machine started to wash. The man with the yellow hat did the same with his machine. "Now I can leave for a while to do some shopping," he said. "You wait here for me, George, but don't get into trouble." George stood and watched the machines. Swoosh went the clothes, back and forth. George loved it. There was an empty machine in the corner. Could he make it work just like the others? George was curious. On a table, he found a pile of clothes. He dropped them into the machine and poured in the soap. First a little, then a little more, then the whole box. He pushed the handle, and the machine started. Now, all the machines were going. Only George's seemed to make more suds than the others. Much more. So much more that they began to float out of the machine right over the top. Soon the suds covered everything, even Mrs. Goodman's basket. George jumped over to the table. The suds were everywhere. A notion of suds poured right out into the street. What a mess! "Help! Help!" cried the owner. "Who put all that soap into the machine?" And he ran to shut it off. "It was that monkey over there," someone shouted. George was scared. He looked around for a place to escape to. People came running from all over trying to catch him, but when they reached the table, George was nowhere to be found. "I've got to clean up," said the owner. "Everybody, please take your clothes out." "That's terrible," said Mrs. Goodman. "Now I can't get my children's uniforms dry in time. I don't even have a clothesline at home. What am I going to do?" Then she dropped the wet clothes into her basket. "Boy, that basket is heavy," she said. "I'll just leave these clothes right here on the porch." And she went into the house. Suddenly, a head appeared from inside the basket. It was George. He had been hiding in there all the time. He jumped out, shook off the soap bubbles, and looked around. There was a big oak tree in the backyard. How good that George was a monkey. Grabbed the clothes, climbed up the tree, and hung the wet uniforms on the branches. Since the sun was shining brightly, the clothes would be dry in no time. A little later, Mrs. Goodman came out of the house. "What a surprise!" "Thank you, George. I'm so pleased," she said. Meanwhile, the man with the yellow hat and the owner of the laundromat had come over. "What you need is a good spanking, George," said the man. "Wait," cried Mrs. Goodman. "I know he made a mess, but he did make up for it. Now the kids can go to the baseball game." "Well," said the owner, "I will let you go this time, but be sure to learn how to use my machines next time." When the uniforms were dry, the children put them on. Then Mrs. Goodman had a surprise. A little uniform for George. Her son had grown out of it. "Now you can go and play baseball with the others," said the man. "And Mrs. Goodman and I are going to watch the game." What a nice afternoon it turned out to be.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Well, let's go and see.
Curious George delivers the papers. "Has the newspaper come yet, George?" asked the man with the yellow hat. George opened the front door and looked out. There was no sign of it anywhere. Sandy always delivered the paper on time, but today she was late. As usual, on the corner was the stack of newspapers waiting to be picked up. George went over to look at them. What would it be like to be a paper boy? George was curious. Quickly, he ran back to the house, got his little red wagon, and rode it down to the corner. He untied the string around the stack of papers, loaded some of them onto the wagon, and started up the street. At the first house, he folded the paper, then he threw it up towards the porch. But the newspaper fell apart. The pages flew all over the lawn. George folded another paper and threw it up to the next house. This time, it got stuck in a tree. George kept on going. Being a paper boy was fun. One paper landed in the middle of a rose bush. Another landed in a bird bath. Finally, Sandy arrived at the corner to pick up her papers. "Where are they?" she asked. "Somebody has taken most of them." Just then, the delivery man drove by in his truck. "I left all of them right here," he said. Up the street, papers were flying all over. "Somebody's playing jokes," said the driver angrily. "Get in the truck, Sandy, and let's find out." George had almost finished his paper route. There was only the big apartment building left. He was just about to go in when the truck screeched to a stop. "There he is," cried the driver. "It's a monkey. I'll teach you a lesson." Then he jumped down to catch George. George was scared. Where could he hide? There was that big apartment building. He leaped as high as he could and disappeared. "Where'd he hide?" asked the driver. "We can't catch him now," said Sandy. "Well, we'd better clean up this mess." She started to pick up the papers. "What am I going to tell my customers?" she asked. Just then, George peeked out from the balcony to see if the coast was clear. Sandy looked up and saw him. "George," she cried, "so there you are. What are you doing away up there?" "Wait a minute. I've got an idea. Come on down and take the rest of my papers. Now you deliver them." How good that George was a monkey. He climbed from balcony to balcony, tossing a paper at each one until all the papers were delivered. Now the job was done and George climbed down. But just before he reached the ground, the delivery man rushed over and was about to grab him. "Now I've got you," he shouted. "You're not going to get away this time." "Wait," cried Sandy. "George did take my papers, but he turned out to be a real delivery boy after all." "He sure did," shouted someone from his balcony. "Hooray for George," shouted a woman. Soon everybody from the building came out and cheered. "Sandy," said the driver, "I'll get you some more papers to finish up." "Let's forget about the mess you made," he said to George. "When you get a little older, maybe I'll give you your own paper route." George waved goodbye to Sandy, and off they went. There was one newspaper left. George brought it back home to his friend, the man with the yellow hat.
This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. This morning, George was curious the moment he woke up, because he knew it was a special day. At breakfast, George's friend said, "Today we are going to celebrate, because just 3 years ago this day, I brought you home with me from the jungle. So tonight, I'll take you to the animal show. But first, I have a surprise for you." He took George out to the yard where a big box was standing. George was very curious. Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted. He knew how to ride a bicycle, but he had never had one of his own. "I must go now," said the man, "but I'll be back in time for the animal show. Be careful with your new bike and keep close to the house while I'm gone." George could ride very well and even do all sorts of tricks. He could ride with both hands off the handlebar. And he could ride like a cowboy on a wild bronco. and he could also ride backwards. But after a while, George got tired of doing tricks and went out into the street. The newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of papers. "That's a fine bike you got there," he said to George. "How would you like to help me deliver the papers?" He handed George the bag and told him to do one side of the street first and then turn back and do the other side. George was very proud as he rode off with his bag. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street as he had been told. When he came to the last house, he saw a little river in the distance. George was curious. So, instead of turning back to deliver the rest of the papers, he just went on. There was a lot to see at the river. A duck family was paddling downstream. A man was fishing from the bridge. And two boys were playing with their boats. George wanted to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boys might find out he hadn't delivered all the papers. So he rode on. While riding along, George kept thinking of boats all the time. It would be such fun to have a boat, but how could he get one? He thought and thought, and then he had an idea. He got off the bicycle, took a newspaper out of the bag, and began to fold it. First, he folded down the corners, like this. Then he folded both edges up, brought the ends together, and flattened it sidewise. Then he turned one corner up, then the other one, again brought the ends together, and flattened it sidewise. Then, gently, he pulled the ends open, and there was his boat. Now the moment had come to launch the boat. Would it float? It did. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he had used up all the papers and had made so many boats that he couldn't count them. A whole fleet. Watching his fleet sailing down the river, George felt like an admiral. But he forgot to watch where he was going. Suddenly, the bicycle hit a rock, and George flew off the seat head first. Luckily, George was not hurt, but the front wheel of the bicycle was all out of shape, and the tire was blown out. George tried to ride the bicycle, but of course it wouldn't go. So he started carrying it, but it soon got too heavy. George didn't know what to do. His new bike was spoiled. The newspapers were gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. Now he just stood there and cried. Suddenly his face brightened. Why, he had forgotten. He could ride on one wheel. He had hardly started out again when rolling toward him came an enormous tractor with huge trailers behind it. Looking out of the trailers were all sorts of animals. The tractor stopped, and two men jumped out. "Well, well," said one of the men, "a little monkey who can ride a bike bronco fashion. We can use you in our animal show tonight. I'm the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat in no time. And then we'll take you along to the place where the show is going to be." So the three of them got into the cab and drove off. "Maybe you could play a fanfare while you ride your bike in the show," the director said. "I have a bugle for you right here. And later on, you'll get a green coat and cap, just like Bob's." On the showgrounds, everybody was busy getting things ready for the show. "I must do some work now," said the director. "Meanwhile, you may have a look around and get acquainted with all the animals. But you must not feed them. especially the ostrich, because he will eat anything and might get very sick afterwards. George was very curious. He wouldn't eat a bugle, or would he? George went a little closer to the cage, and before he knew it, the ostrich had snatched the bugle and tried to swallow it. But it got stuck in his throat. Funny sounds came out as the ostrich was struggling with the bugle, all blue in the face. George was frightened. Fortunately, the men had heard the noise. They came rushing to the cage and got the bugle out of the ostrich's throat just in time. The director was very angry with George and said, "You can't take part in the show now. We'll have to send you home." George had to sit on a bench all by himself. He was terribly sorry for what he had done, but now it was too late. Meanwhile, the ostrich had got hold of a string dangling near his cage. This string held the door to the cage of the baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled at it, the door opened, and the baby bear got out. He ran straight for a high tree near the camp. George jumped up, grabbed the bugle, and blew as loud as he could. The men heard the alarm. When they saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling at the string, they knew what had happened. George rushed to his bicycle and raced toward the tree. The men were worried because they didn't know how to get the little bear down safely. But George had his plan. He went up the tree as fast as only a monkey can, and when he reached the baby bear, he put him in his bag and carefully let him down so that the men could safely catch him. Hooray! Everybody cheered, and the director said, "George, you are a brave little monkey. You saved the baby bear's life. Now you'll get your coat back. And of course, you may ride your bike and play the bugle in the show." Finally, the show was on. The whole town had come to see it. And how surprised they were to discover George on his bike right in the middle of it. The newsboy was there, and also the man with the yellow hat. He'd been looking for George everywhere and was happy to have found him at last. The newsboy was glad to have his bag again, and the people from the other side of the street whose papers George had made into boats were not angry with him anymore. When the time had come for George to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and the cap and the bugle. And then George and his friend got into the car and went home.